So, again, it's the mix that we have here today. There's a person who taught me a lot about restorative justice, and say a global figure, and he sums it up on 5 fingers. The right people, in the right place, at the right time, having the right conversations or dialogue to have the right outcome. And I think I have that feel about the group we have today. And it's my pleasure now to introduce our next speaker, Professor Theo Gavrielides from the International Academic Research Studies Centre. Theo, I just mentioned before we start, there are some publications over here which I should have mentioned earlier in the morning on the table. Please browse, have a look, you may find them interesting. Theo, if you want to expand on that,
sure, yeah.
I'll give it to you.
Well, can I first say thank you for the invitation, and thank you for putting me after lunch. I don't know why people they always put me after lunch, and I know slowly going to start digesting and going into a coma, so I'm going to try and keep this as entertaining and as engaging as possible. But yeah, thank you, and I'll speak about IRS and IJ for in a bit. But thank you for inviting me, because I think it's a very timely and much needed workshop, bringing all different disciplines together. And it just happens that I was given this lovely task by 2 different publishers to edit 2 books on psychology and restorative justice and empathy and restorative justice. And I'm a lawyer, I don't know much about biology, neurology, psychology, and all these different disciplines, including arts, and me being Greek, I have written about tragedy and restorative justice. I would love to send you that paper, and I'll speak about it. And so it's all these different disciplines come together. And for me, this workshop is very much needed. So really looking forward to see what's going to come out of it, and hopefully work together. I've learned so much today, and I've got some sort of a presentation, but it's thinking in progress. So I'm going to speak about some basic concepts, and I'm coming mainly from the restorative justice side. And having done restorative justice for over 10 years, this is very refreshing. It's a very refreshing workshop because we tend to talk about the same things. And it's good to talk about restorative justice from a different perspective. So I'm going to cover some basic concepts, and then we'll try and talk about the different things that are coming out of it. So this is what I had in mind. And I'm putting rehabilitation because me being a criminologist, and when you talk about empathy and restorative justice, you might mean a number of things. You might mean the relationship between parents, you might mean the relationship between neighbourhoods or work conflicts. I want to put it within the context of rehabilitation, and I think that's what we've been talking about. But before I go into the presentation, a little bit about rehabilitation, which traditionally has been seen as obviously something for the offender, and something about curing the offender. So the offender has something bad, or they have a drug issue or an alcohol issue, and we're doing something to rectify that. Well, there's a new tendency now to say, well, rehabilitation theories are actually not, might be actually against human rights, the human rights of the offender. We're looking at the reoffending rates, and we're thinking about it in a different way. So the new way of looking at it is to see what are the strengths of these offenders. So what are the things that make them we could tap into? What are the talents that they have that we could tap into, so that we can encourage them to reintegrate without looking just at what their problems are. So that without looking too much at controlling their drug addiction or their alcohol addiction, we see that certain offenders might be interested in arts, might be interested in plumbing. So we tap into what good they have, and we encourage it to help them reintegrate. And that moves away from the kind of traditional rehabilitation theories, which are about what is wrong with the offender. So that's where kind of restorative justice comes in for me. And I want to talk about empathy because it's already been covered. But yeah, it's the 2 elements. So here we are with restorative justice. There are so many definitions about restorative justice. The literature on restorative justice since the 70s, it's been phenomenal. And I would say my own PhD is on about the definition of restorative justice. And I would say that we should stop defining what is. Restorative justice is what it is. and start thinking a little bit outside of the box. So if we take the restorative justice concept into two kind of components, which I kind of said two components for empathy, two components for rehabilitation, and all of them have something in common, is the value side and then the practical side. So the same goes for restorative justice. It has this, I define it as ethos, and that was the definition that came out of an international research project that I did, and all practitioners that I asked used the word ethos first, and then circles, or mediation, or conferencing, or so on and so forth. So it's those ethos and principles that are based on dialogue and equality, the empowerment of the parties, responsibility taking, future thinking, respect and restoring. And then there's the different types of practices, and I'm going to come to the issue of practices because it is within the cultural context, and I think certain practices are meant to succeed and certain practices are not meant to succeed, and what sort of adaptations we do depending on the cultural context and the geographical context. So that's restorative justice without obsessing about this definition and choosing different authors and strands. And why empathy? I think we touched on that already. If empathy is all about communicating the feelings, or communicating in kind of a two-way process with somebody else, and that's what restorative justice is all about, is the dialogue-based conflict resolution approach, as opposed to the sterile, and maybe in a criminal lawyer thinking the sterile criminal justice way of dealing it either through an adversarial or an inquisitorial process where the offender and the victim have no participation in resolving the case. And it does give us some sort of emotional awareness. So is this the perfect tool for a restorative justice dialogue? Well, let me tell you where we are with empathy and restorative justice. And as I said, this is not my background. I came to know about this because of this editing that I'm doing of these two books, and I'll mention them because one of them, there's actually an opportunity, if anyone wants to contribute, I'll speak about it towards the end. It's still ongoing. The first one is going to be published very soon. And that's how I got to find about this different disciplines. So there's loads of literature on empathy. There is huge literature on restorative justice, but there isn't any literature on restorative justice and empathy. There's a couple of articles and one book that came out recently, but that's it. But there are attempts to link empathy and restorative justice, and I was glad to hear about the art side of it, the catharsis, and I'll come to that in a minute. The neuroscience, Daniel is writing for the book. The sociology of emotions and new strands within sociology. Affect-strict psychology, it's a new theory that's coming up, trying to understand, from a psychology point of view and a biological point of view, restorative justice, and obviously positive psychology, which is kind of the good life model that I mentioned at the beginning, which is the opposite of the negative way of looking at rehabilitation. Just going to pause there a minute in terms of rehabilitation. And this, when we talk about rehabilitation, we think about, it's a theory of sentencing. Yeah, so it's when you teach law students criminal law courses, we talk about just desserts, rehabilitation, and different types of theories. I was teaching it, but I wasn't really understanding it. And for me, rehabilitation and punishment, the word punishment, became real when I started taking part in restorative justice practices. And I'll give you one example, which I was in Canada and I was attending different circles. Circles is a form of restorative justice, and it's where people come around the circle, there is no hierarchy, there's a keeper of the circle, and people get to talk about an experience, which is usually something that has harmed the people who are around the circle. The victim and the offender will be part of the circle, and there is a talking piece that goes from one person to the other, and they're given the opportunity to talk. Some psychologists who might be in this room will be thinking, it just rings a bell, circles and discussions and sharing and expression of emotions. Well, that is a typical restorative justice practice. So here I am, And this institution is a prison or Ferndale institution which has all sorts of offenders, mainly rapists and murderers, and there's 47 of them, raining outside, pretty dark, and here I am amongst the prisoners who started going around the circle sharing their experiences. And it was close to Christmas, it was during Restorative Justice Week, which is the third week of November every year. And, as we were going around the circle, one, this big man with tattoos and, a rapist, and, he started sharing his experience. He was saying, I deserve to be here and I deserve not to have Christmas, but my mum has cancer and it's her last Christmas. She doesn't deserve this and I wanted to be with her. And started crying and, and sharing his feelings. This guy's were in prison and we're not going to get anything out of the circle. It was just a circle that was done to, it was part of their reintegration program. Yeah? So I started feeling their pain. I started feeling what they were going through. And he was just one example. And for me, it kind of started to translate what actually punishment is. It wasn't the fact that they were in a cell. It was the fact that they were going through a transformation process of pain, deconstructing themselves through that pain that circle enabled them to have, and then putting themselves back together almost like a different person. And then I started looking into what actual punishment is, and again, me with my Greek roots, looking at the word punishment comes from the Greek word ini, which comes from the word bonos, which means pain. Funny enough. So here we are, punishment meaning pain, but in our heads, because of the last 2 years of punishment and control theories and the application of the criminal justice system in the way that it is, we understand punishment in the form of imprisonment, maybe, or money, paying money. But punishment can be, pain could be expressed in different ways. So if restorative justice is one way, circle or mediation or of conferencing is one way of expressing that pain, and through a deconstruction of yourself, through that pain, and then a reconstruction of yourself, and coming out of it as a different person, through a catharsis, and if you've ever seen the Greek tragedy, then you will understand what I mean. Just going through the pain of the main actors, and then the audience participating, being part of that pain, and then coming out of it as different people. Then you almost kind of understand that there's a different way of doing rehabilitation, of transformation. And here's the checkpoint for me, and I do talk about and write about restorative justice, but I have a disclaimer, I'm not an advocate of restorative justice, but I'm not an adversary of restorative justice, I'm a researcher of restorative justice, I kind of sit in the middle. And there are strengths and there are weaknesses, and when it comes to understanding, the psychological aspects, whether it's empathy or the different tools that restorative justice might be using, there are huge gaps. And I'll just put two there. I haven't seen personally any pilots with restorative justice and psychologists coming together, so actual cases that are being monitored and evaluated. I'm evaluating a project in prisons at the minute, but it's not from a psychological point of view. I'm not a psychologist yet. I haven't seen anything from a pilot point of view that would give us some sort of concrete research data, scientific data, and I'll come to the scientific in a minute because we have obsession with quantitative data. And we need to put a little bit more emphasis on the qualitative side. There's an argument I'm having with norms at the minute. And the norms of understanding of restorative justice and a theory. I spoke about the effect strip psychology before. It's a new theory. It doesn't mean that you might you subscribe to it, but we need more of that. And there is a huge gap. So until we get there, I'm actually feeling that we're comparing apples with oranges. I mean, it's good to investigate it. But it's not good for me to have these amazing claims that these sort of fantastic things can happen. So we need to be a little bit more careful and a little bit more evidence-based or evidence-driven as opposed to campaigning for the sake of it. I'm happy to have a debate about it. I mean, it's obviously good to kind of explore new ways of doing things, but let's not forget that if we're going to talk about restorative justice in the criminal justice way, we are diverting a case from the criminal justice system. We spoke about participation of victims, which is very important. But tell any victim, you know, you can stretch victims of murder or rape or sexual violence, that your case actually is going to be diverted, and they're not going to go to prison, and they're going to go down the restorative justice route. As a criminal lawyer, I'm thinking, well, how serious are we? Yeah, and there is an act now in England and Wales that allows that. You know, you can divert a case at the sentencing stage or pre-sentencing that goes straight into restorative justice route. Yeah, there is a possibility that's in April. But my questions are, what is the infrastructure? Who knows about it? Do the judges know? Is there enough practice out there, and is there enough evidence out there, and is there enough understanding, normative understanding of it? So, before we explore the gaps with pilots, because if you're going to go for funding to get money to do pilots with psychologists and practitioners, which would be great, or me start editing the book and creating new theories about restorative justice, I do think that we need to look, the restorative justice movement needs to think about itself. So there is a big issue with the restorative justice movement that needs to be sorted out. Probably, I wouldn't say first, but in conjunction with the exploration of this new field. There's loads of issues, in my view. There's some of them up there, and I'll try to unpack them. And the reason I'm doing this is because I do think we need to be realistic as we explore this new and exciting area of partnership of different disciplines. Restorative justice is relatively new, though as a theory, you know, as a concept, you know, you might find it in Greek traditions and Egyptian traditions and, you know, all sorts of places. But within the criminal justice system, it's relatively new. So suddenly there is this global hysteria, as I call it. You know, restorative justice is the new thing. You know, it cuts down costs and let's go for it. Yeah. And there is this sudden pressure from governments, not just in the UK, loads of other countries that are kind of throwing a lot of money and expecting people to just, you know, get on with it and do it. So we need to be very careful with that. And obviously, you know, things change, and I've seen restorative justice in the Labour government, at least in the UK, had a consultation, had a restorative justice unit in the Home Office. They had this huge evidence-based program that got to one Australian and one American academic to evaluate. They had the evaluation. It's called Restorative Justice: The Evidence. Came out, and then suddenly nothing. Quiet. Nothing. And another 10 years passed. Everything was dismantled. The money that went in, we're thinking, so what's going to happen now? You know, people who were involved in the pilots, you know, were left without jobs. The organisation's closed. The practice is closed. And then the Conservatives came. And there were a couple of stories in the media. We had the riots, and people were thinking, oh no, no more people in prison, let's find another way. And there was this research with matrix evidence, whatever it's been told, and it said, well, with every pound, you save £9 with restorative justice. So let's go for it, you know? And that brought it back. Started investing loads of money. There is this huge investment that goes now into training prison officers, and that's coming to an end now. And I can tell you a lot about prisons. Prisons and restorative justice. And then there's lots of other funding that is being thrown into restorative justice without thinking. Let's pause for a minute and think: what is actually restorative justice? Is this a structured way of providing justice? Because if we look at what restorative justice is, Braithwaite wrote a lot about this, and you look at the 70s articles. It is all about taking it away from lawyers, taking it away from the state, and giving it to the parties. But here we are, in a top-down, structured way, trying to provide restorative justice in a very controlled manner. It's kind of going against the very nature of this approach, yeah? Which I'm not saying has to be an either-or. It can be both, but you can't take the heart out of it. You'd be creating some sort of a hybrid that would not last for too long. So that's what I mean by institutionalization and legalization. it's good to have laws, and a lawyer, of course it's good to have laws, but are laws the best way of enforcing and mainstreaming restorative justice? Because restorative justice, in the UK, is a classic example. It existed without legislation. It existed because it came out of communities. It was done by mediators. It was done by passionate people without legislation. But it was done. We didn't need legislation. We have legislation, and I'm asking you, has anything changed? I would love to do a project and see how many cases have actually gone through after the legislation, and what sort of support we're getting, and whether we're getting better cases after the legislation. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it's not a solution, and we shouldn't stop there. Our emphasis should be about what sort of support we give to the community, who is tasked by definition to do restorative justice practices. And the top-down structures and control. To have regulators is great. When you talk about medicine, we talk about psychology, we talk about lawyers, it's good to have regulators and auditors. But here's something to think about. Can you go to an elder and say, look, you've got to be registered to do restorative justice practice? Let's just think about it a little bit, yeah? And in the same way, people have been doing restorative justice for decades. All the practitioners that I spoke to, and they are practitioners, as Pete said, there's different types of practitioners. There's the physicians who are well known to be able to manage complex cases like rape and domestic violence, which is kind of a no-go. And then there's practitioners that kind of just got on board with a 3-day training. Now, go to the first group that has been doing it for 30, 40 years and say, you've got to register and be audited by this whatever in order to do it. It's a bit contradictory with the nature of restorative justice. I haven't got anything against it, but from a theoretical, normative point of view, and somebody who is interested in the, not in any politics or in any funding situation that comes with restorative justice, I have to say what I see and also what I've seen being done in other countries, because other countries make the same mistakes. So this kind of professionalisation of restorative justice, which still in the UK 90% of it is done by volunteers, but suddenly we think that volunteers are not professionals. Volunteers doesn't mean that you're not professional. Actually, you can be more professional than the professionals. And then, me asking what is actually the moral justification for restorative justice. And it's an example, I was talking about this, with the riots that we had in London, and they had riots in Vancouver, where I'm based as a visiting professor. And we're just having this conversation that, we're walking down the street, cleaning the streets, and, just coming together, and so that's brilliant. But if you're going to divert the rioters from the criminal justice system, that's slightly different from just cleaning the streets and and just creating a feeling of community. It's a little bit more than that. We need to find our moral justification for doing so. And then, of course, the battles within, and those who how many people are kind of call themselves restorative justice people? 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. That's 10. That's a good number. And I spoke about this, so I have no fear. Don't have some sort of hate crosses that sort of nervous. There are battles within the restorative justice movement, and those battles are the power structure battles, whether they are in relation to funding or in relation to organisations, in relation to projects. And to my amusement, though our practice is all about dialogue, I find restorative justice people very difficult to have dialogue. Say no more. So, raising the middle of responsibility, some of my reflections. We do need to address the normative gap in restorative justice, and there is a lot of work that can be done. And again, I don't mean yet more definitions about restorative justice. I mean, things like what is the justification that we're having for putting somebody in the pain that I mentioned before? How can we justify it? If a person is going to start crying and deconstruct themselves and expose themselves to all sorts of risks, we mentioned the Forgiveness Project, we highlighted the Forgiveness Project, and a few other projects, and I can tell you there are more risks in terms of suicides when people realise, especially for young offenders in institutions, because they are in very volatile, very, very risky environment psychologically, when they're exposed to to what they've done, is actually quite dangerous. So when we actually engage in that process, and I'm not a psychologist, but I have seen them falling apart. I remember a young guy who, I think he was like 15 years old, and after a lot of support, he agreed to meet the mother of a victim. It was a series of assault. The victim didn't want to meet them, but the mother was willing to meet him, and she came with the purse and stuff, and he was terrified that she was going to bring a knife or a gun out, pull it out of the bag and kill him. And he ran out the minute he saw the bag. I was like, where are you going? He's like, she's going to kill me. He's like, she's not going to kill you. Trust me, she's not going to kill you. There's all these fears and all this, it's a very risky environment to expose these people. And sometimes, I'm still involved in a child abuse project within institutions, including the Catholic Church, and they're offering restorative justice. And we had 2 suicides in the last 10 years that I've been monitoring the project, when people realise what's happened because they engage in the dialogue. 2 suicides because restorative justice opened the box. Open the Pandora box of feelings and emotions, of empathy, of communication. And when we do that, because it is serious stuff, it's not just throwing people in prison and just good luck with it, we do need to have, from a normative point of view, an explanation and justification. At least the criminal justice system does that. We might not do it in the best way possible, but there are a lot of normative explanations, whether it's just desserts or whether it's the rehabilitation theory, the human rights framework that exists, and human rights campaigners have fought for this for a long time. And address the evidence gap, more pilots, more research, and not research with, just the usual suspects, research with complex cases. I'm involved in the domestic violence project. We are trying to find Grace, back with Josie, we've been trying hard this month to find victims of domestic violence, and if anyone knows victims of domestic violence, please tell us and raise your hands, Grace, and Josie, just tell Jason Grace, because we're trying to find evidence of cases of domestic violence and restorative justice, and there's nothing, absolutely nothing. Well, people said we're doing it, and we're actually saying, so who's actually doing it, and let's get the evidence. Actually, no. The same goes with other conflict cases, like hate crimes and race cases and so on. So if we are going to strengthen the evidence base of restorative justice, let's not pursue the usual stuff. Let's just challenge ourselves as researchers, as academics, a little bit more and be brave. If it's not possible to do that, let's just say it. It's not possible to do that. But stop making this huge claim that is the next best thing. And I'm interested in this because I saw it in Canada. I haven't seen it here in the UK. But expressing restorative justice values and practice through art. And I attended a 4-day conference, an art-based conference on restorative justice in Canada, in Vancouver, and it was brilliant. They were using poetry, dance, theatre to bring people together. It was participatory, so you had to take part. And I think that's where culture might be a barrier, because from a European kind of English perspective, we're like dancing. But we did, and it was great. But it is all about addressing those, taking into consideration the cultural barriers when we apply this kind of different tools. We do need to sort out our power structures, both within and outside of the restorative justice movement. Maybe restorativists need their own mediation, their own conferencing, and we might just set up our own kind of conflict resolution process, or an organisation that can do that for us. I don't know. And I think Pete spoke about this. You always get kind of 2 columns: the criminal justice system and the restorative justice system. Well, I think it's an inferiority complex. We should just stop feeling that the restorative justice system is not as good or is better than the criminal justice system. It is what it is. Why do we need to compare apples with oranges? Let's just take it for what it is and just focus on understanding it and developing it, as opposed to comparing it and proving its value against the criminal justice system. I think the difficulties with the latter. I remember I was at a race restorative justice conference in the US, and we had this big campaign on race. Angela Davis, if anyone knows her, and she was put in prison, and she was saying, get rid of prisons. I mean, there was a huge problem, 700 people, and it was on race, and I can tell you that it was very well attended with minority groups. And when you go to this sort of conference, it was very expressive, and people were standing up and clapping, and here I am, very presenting my evidence, and I say, well, Angela Davis, I agree and disagree with you, because it's and if you're watching this video on the internet, you probably watch it. I've said it already. So you can say I agree with you, but I also disagree, because it's not good saying that we can get rid of prisons. Is this ever possible? What is actually more difficult is improving prisons. How can we improve the system that we've got, not try and preach that we can get rid of it? We can't. And in my view, it's very difficult to get rid of a system that is called imprisonment. So how can we improve the system through a restorative justice way, by focusing on not comparing it, but developing its values, developing its evidence, and using this new multidisciplinary approach and support each other, because we all have those different strengths, to enhance what we've got. I don't think they agreed with me. In fact, somebody came and said, how dare you disagree with Angela Davis? Well, that's not what I did. And then obviously address the reality, and it is, we are very complex human beings, and that also means we have very complex emotions, and also very complex social structures, cultural structures, and until we understand that and say, whether it's about funding, and say, well, the money is what it is, what can we do with it? Especially since we're claiming that for every £9 we save so much. So let's just come together and work in partnership. Is this possible? And here I am extending the partnership arm. I run a charity, so very, very interested in working with you on bringing all these disciplines together. Why do we need to compete to get this small pot of money and then be controlled from the top down? Let's just come together and think about it. These are the two books that I mentioned. One is called The Psychology of Restorative Justice, and it's bringing all these different disciplines. I played with the words because I didn't want to talk just about psychology or restorative justice. It's the psychology of restorative justice, including me thinking, what is the psychology of restorative justice? And this is a collection of papers that is now done. I haven't read them yet. But the other one, which is Offenders No More, is still ongoing. So anyone interested in any papers that might come out of this conference, contributing, they're both peer-reviewed. One is published by HGED and the other one by Nova, which is New York's publisher. The other one is still ongoing, so let me know if you're interested. And what it's trying to do is collapse labels, such as offenders and such as rehabilitation, and use different strands to identify kind of a different multidisciplinary route for addressing the issue of crime. So, for instance, restorative justice is a classic example where the labels of offenders and victims don't really make much sense, because you remove those labels when you enter the room. It's not about the offender or the victim. And most cases, actually, if anyone has been involved in a case, would say that there are no offenders and victims. Everybody's an offender and a victim, especially in the more complex of cases. So there are the two applications there, and they're all on this website called Restorative Justice For All. There's a second organisation that I'm involved in. Vasa is here, which is the other director, and we kind of came up with this idea a few years ago because we felt that there's a lot about restorative justice, but there's a lot of control of what is about restorative justice. So we kind of create this platform which is called a peer-review journal, which is downloadable for free, a library on restorative justice, which is all free, and there is subscription, which is again free, and it all goes there, and people can go and download. And it is literally Restorative Justice For All. It's got media and videos and different events and all that. And www. But the information about the book is already there. And that's how you can get in touch with me. I tried to keep it compact so that we can engage in a discussion. I'll probably upset a few people, but you can upset me back. Question or?
I think people can just fire away.
Do you think the reason we don't work with each other is because we're too scared we're going to pinch each other's ideas and things like that?
Well, people need a
There's something else
psychologist.
going on there.
I'm not a psychologist, but I can tell you from my experience, I think there is different types of fears, and there's also, the kind of attitude, my practice is better, this model is better, and there is no better and worse. And there's also now, actually things are, in my view, and I'm not usually pessimistic, I'm very optimistic, but the last year and a half, like in the UK at least, I'm kind of watching a train which is bound to crash, and I don't want to be on it. I'm watching it. I get on it when it crashes. And what I mean by that is that there is this fear, particularly amongst practitioners, that if they don't get on this train, which is going to crash, then they're not going to get the funding, and they're not going to be part of a group, they're not going to be whatever. What I say to them, because I can say I'm not a practitioner, but again, my salary doesn't depend on it, is you've never been on that train anyway. Well, why do you need to get on it now?
Thank you. That's one now what we seem to do a lot. And I'm not I'm an optimist. And sometimes I do get very sad about what I see with that, and we won't work with each other. As a victim of crime, that makes me sad.
Exactly. And I mean, just to clarify, I'm not advocating for any government here. And I mentioned too, both the Labour and the new government, the Conservative coalition government, they've done different things in different ways, and it's not now a political direction. It's actually governments change, they come and go, right? The situation is, do you attach yourself with a certain policy that has a deadline, and you can see it, or do you remain faithful to what you've been doing for a number of years? Now, again, as I said, I can only look at it from a research point of view, compare it with other countries, and look at the mistakes that other countries have done, and just offer my insights, and then people can decide what to do.
Can I really enjoyed your talk because it sort of summed up some of the things I've been trying to think through. So with the arts and criminal justice, there's the same issues. It's exactly the same. There's no evidence. Practitioners can see that what they're doing works. They're required increasingly to produce statistical data, which is quantitative rather than qualitative, to prove to government. And it doesn't matter which government; they still have to prove it. So what you're asking for is more evidence-based work to be delivered, and I support that. But I sort of really feel for the practitioners because coming from a practice-led college, that we work in a similar way, and it's sort of when you can see change happen, when you see good actually occurring, that it's hard to sort of imagine you've got to spend most of the budget or most of your time like getting the evidence for somebody else who doesn't. That's very frustrating. But the thing I suppose I really wanted to say, which is about prison, and that it strikes me that the work I've seen from the arts and criminal justice is like amazing work, and I think that there is a role for these things to join up. That literally that some of the techniques, and I'd be very happy to put it on the website that you because there's no point in creating another website, like what we use was already there. So I'm very happy for all that work to go there. But it seems to me that it makes sense to try and figure out how to join things up. And I wonder if you had any thoughts about how that might work.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Yes, it's been one of my biggest passions the last 4 years about bringing research, practice and policy together. So let me say 3 things about that. One, in relation to evidence, I did say I had a big row with NOMS, and when you Google Theo NOMS, you will probably come up with my open letters, and it says, please, because all their commissioning intentions, which are announced in November every year, they say in order to get funding, you have to have quantitative evidence that your practice is good. And now with the new Transforming Rehabilitation framework where different partnerships with private and public and charity organisations come together. You have to prove quantitatively that you're doing a good job. When I kept me with, because I'm on the advisory board as well, so I keep saying it internally and externally. And I said, well, certain things cannot be measured quantitatively. It's all about stories. You spoke about stories. You know, it's all about case studies. It's all about in-depth analysis of the impact that you're having. And this sort of, I mean, how do you follow the journey of a young offender whose life is so complex with a quantitative questionnaire and variables within an SPSS package? It just can't happen. So trying to explain that, and I'm having that debate, is an ongoing debate. I had it with a minister just at a conference when he was running out, and I was like, grab the victims minister and say, well, you do need to keep this, we promise we will, and in the next commission document we'll mention it. So that's one. The second point is about relationships between practitioners and researchers. There's huge, huge suspicion. When you ask practitioners to go into practice and research it, it's very difficult. For me it has been possible, and people who have been in this situation, they will know what I mean, to open the door for a researcher, take part, in a meeting that by definition is behind closed doors. And there's also all sorts of other layers of trust that needs to be developed. And I'm not saying that it can't, it can, and there are good examples of partnerships, but we can work more on that. I think there's a lot more to be done. And then the policy side of it, when you get the evidence, and then you go and suggest, do you let the practitioner down? How do you manage those dynamics, those ethics, whether it's research ethics or the policy suggestion that you're going to make after you found the evidence about the practice? Where do you go from it? I mean, the domestic violence project that we're doing, there's so many different dynamics. You have the women's movement, you have the restorative justice movement, the victims movement. How do you embrace as an objective researcher all those different dynamics and agendas when you put the recommendation to the EU who is funding you to do something around restorative justice and domestic violence? You need to be very truthful and objective when you make those recommendations. So I had three things about it. It's an issue. And the third thing is about infrastructure, because you said when you are on the front line and you are a practitioner and you're saving lives, you don't have time to measure what you're doing. So when you fund a project, fund infrastructure for the evaluation of the project, so that the frontline worker doesn't have to be saving people from gangs and whatever it is. It doesn't have to think about the evaluation. It's already built in, because the fund took consideration of the fact that yes, we do want you to prove us that it did what it did, but we also have an inbuilt way of doing it, and we're not expecting you to do that. And then the evaluator needs to increase the capacity of those organisations to become kind of almost like an organic process of collecting that data without putting too much emphasis on it. There's ways of doing it.
Have you seen the tools that Nesta have used to help people? Yeah,
and I mean, there's now a fund called the Impact Readiness Fund. Actually, we just closed next week, and we're one of the providers. Actually, this week. And the purpose of it, which is the throwing loads of money, is about having an inbuilt kind of way of putting an evidence base for this sort of projects, not just justice projects, but generally social justice projects. But 1 month to apply, and then 3 months to deliver it, and it's multi-million program, and it's just crazy, because the government is going to change, and they want everything done by May. And who has the time to do everything by May and apply within a month while you have Christmas in the middle? So yeah, we're offering, but let's offer generally, and taking into consideration that these small projects, which usually have 1 or 2 staff, can't actually write applications, and if they do, they're probably writing them in the evening or during the weekends, because when they go back to work, the last thing they want to do is fill out application forms. Sorry.
So the evidence isn't there. The methods for collecting it either don't exist or aren't robust enough. Yet there are reduced resources available to any sort of public service. And as a consequence, those who have responsibility to invest those resources need to invest it against something. How do I know where best to spend your, my her money, because there's lots of competing demands on that money. So either we need to do better than the answer we've got thus far, which is we don't have an answer,
Yeah.
or the other area that you can start to approach is what we see in other medical contexts, which is client-centred services, which is actually where we say, look, we can't tell you really ultimately which of these complicated, intertwined actions are going to deliver you the outcome you're after, but we can give you a portfolio of different choices that you can make, and as much information as we can give you to support that. And after that, we're actually saying to you that through paying your tax and what have you, your right is you've got about 10k to spend on this. What do you want to spend it on? Do you want some RJ in there? Do you want this in there? What do you want to spend that on? And maybe that's a part of the sort of redesign that could go around this. If we don't have a more robust way of being able to generate rigorous and sort of acceptable evidence.
Yeah, two things. One, sorry if I created the impression that there is no evidence full stop. There is, but with certain types of offenders and certain types of crimes. So it's not across the board. There is no evidence when it comes to complex cases such as domestic violence, for instance. There's a lot more work that needs to be done. But there's a lot of evidence, when it comes to different types of, theft or shoplifting and so on. Tim's going to speak it now. What happens in Northern Ireland and young offenders? Loads of stuff there. Loads of evidence. So it's not across the board. Though we do have evidence for certain practices and certain offenders. What I'm saying is that when we don't, let's be very, very careful before we offer it. Well, your suggestion, which is what it's all about, Restorative Justice is all about, is a democratic, voluntary process, which now is offered, should be offered at the court stage. If the victim and the offender choose to opt, if they opt for restorative justice, then and it's explained and it's offered in a genuine and voluntary-based kind of way, then I think it's part of what democracy is all about. It kind of goes into kind of more wider democratic way of offering somebody the opportunity to say, well, look, we're not going to step in as the criminal justice system to put them in prison and sentence them. You're taking the responsibility, both of you, to do something about it. Yeah? We might not have the evidence if it's a domestic violence case, but you're choosing it. Yeah? And then the question for me is, which is for the system and the government or any funding body, to have the responsibility of safeguarding. Yeah? So you have the right people to deliver a case, the infrastructure to support that choice. If it's about psychological support or victim support services, and in fact now there's a new law. We have conference that we did just a month ago in a book there about the Victims Directive. Nobody seems to know. In fact, we'll have a training next week on the Victims Directive and Restorative Justice. Again, if anybody's interested, it's great. We have a new law that protects victims in terms of their human rights when they engage with restorative justice. It is about that implementation. If they choose to, if they choose to go for restorative justice, I think that's where the state should intervene, and not force restorative justice because it's a cheaper option.
You're obviously not legal. Which countries, non-English speaking countries, have involved restorative justice infrastructure?
Have done so?
And involved restorative justice infrastructure and a strong restorative justice scene, which are not English speaking.
You'd be surprised.
I'm genuinely wondering because I'm Russian.
Yeah. There are RJ projects in Russia, would you agree? Yeah.
Now I'm surprised.
I know a lot more about Europe and Canada and the US, but I've seen, I was very, very surprised, I was talking about this yesterday, in Japan, there's, if you look up, published a couple of pages on the history of restorative justice, and actually the roots, you can find them in Japanese, Chinese, Greek, Egyptian cultures, the actual, roots, when Achilles were talking about, negotiating the conflict. This sort of in the columns and in the scripts of this kind of ancient civilization. So that it's there, but they have the same problem that we have, which is identifying them. I did a mapping exercises of RJ projects in prisons, and I'll tell you with all certainty, those who were saying that we're doing RJ, they weren't, And those who weren't saying that they're being jailed, actually they were. You know? That's the funny thing, because they didn't realise they're actually doing restorative justice. But those who were saying, yeah, we've got funding and we're doing restorative justice, it was all about processing. It was like, you need to go downstairs and tell sorry, because that's what you need to do. That's not restorative justice. But it kind of makes sense because they were being pressurised to do restorative justice. And restorative justice is an organic process that we all do. We do it with our children. We do it with our, work, everywhere. Now, if it's about a criminal justice system, it's as I said before, it's a little bit more serious. But it would be interesting to do a research project on non-English speaking countries that do restorative justice. I think my main concern is that I would say without hesitation, 95% of the restorative justice literature is English speaking. That's why I'm passionate seeing, we just finished a project with 4 different countries. All the results that we produce is on this website, which is RJ in Europe. So all the results that we produce, we asked our German, Dutch, Greek partners and Bulgarian partners to write them in their own language. So for the first time you can have Bulgarian, German, Dutch and Greek evidence reports, including English, under this tab. And I think we need more of that. Well, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.